The courthouse steps were no longer stone and marble. They were a stage. Flashbulbs erupted like lightning across a stormy sky, each click of the camera slicing the silence into fragments of anticipation. They are pulsed with chance voices swelling, clashing, overlapping until they became a single roar. Justice. Justice. They weren't just shouting for one woman. They were shouting for every voice that had been silenced, every truth that had been mocked, every immigrant and outsider told they did not belong. And then she appeared, Jasmine Crockett, her figure cut through the crowd with a calm that seemed almost defiant in its steadiness. Reporters surged forward, microphones thrust like weapons, their questions colliding in a blur of noise. But Crockett didn't flinch. She lifted her head, eyes steady, jaw set. And in that moment, the cameras knew they had captured something more than a headline. They had captured history in motion. The voiceover began, low and charged. No one thought she would dare. Until today. For weeks, whispers had raced through political circles. A lawsuit? Against JD Vance, the chosen heir to the MAGA machine. Impossible, they said. Dangerous, they warned. But what was impossible yesterday had become undeniable today. In her hands, tightly gripped, were the documents that carried not just her name, but the weight of a challenge that would test the very core of American politics. Onlookers pressed against the barricades, phones raised high, desperate to record the moment for proof that someone had finally stood up. Some faces glowed with hope, others twisted with fury, but all eyes locked on the woman who dared to turn accusation into action. JD Vance's name hovered in the air like smoke, thick with arrogance and entitlement. He was supposed to be untouchable, shielded by the MAGA empire, armored in the mythology of power. And yet, here she was, striking at the center of that illusion. Gasps rippled as Crockett stepped toward the courthouse doors, the chant of the crowd surging louder, the cameras flashing faster. This wasn't just paperwork. It was a thunderbolt hurled against the heart of a movement built on fear and swagger. She knew the machinery of hate would come for her the smears, and as the heavy doors creaked open, the voice-over dropped to a whisper that felt like prophecy. But what happened inside the courtroom would shake the movement to its very core. Why did this moment matter so much? Why did the filing of one lawsuit rattle the foundations of a political empire? To understand that, you have to see what was really at stake. JD Vance wasn't just another senator. He was the golden child of a movement that had spent nearly a decade reshaping American politics in its own image. To the MAGA base, Vance wasn't merely a politician. He was a symbol the man anointed as heir to the crown, whispered about in closed-door strategy meetings as the vice presidential pick who could secure the future of the movement. His story had been polished, rehearsed, and sold as the tale of a poor kid from Appalachia who clawed his way into power. For MAGA, he was the perfect vessel. A man who could dress populism in Ivy League polish, who could sneer with the working class while dining with billionaires. And that's what made Crockett's move so seismic, because Crockett wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to have the resources, the backing, the audacity to confront the chosen one of the movement. She was meant to be dismissed as a loud freshman congresswoman, a momentary spark in the storm who would fade away under the weight of the machine. Instead, she had become something else entirely, a voice that resonated far beyond her district. A symbol for communities who had been told for generations to sit down, to wait their turn, to accept the scraps of dignity that power allowed them. Her lawsuit was more than a legal challenge. It was a declaration, a line drawn in the sand between truth and deception, between the promise of democracy and the cynical games of those who used it for their own gain. And people knew it. That's why the cameras had gathered, why the chants outside the courthouse sounded more like a movement than a protest. It wasn't about one politician suing another. It was about whether the myth of MAGA's invincibility could be pierced, and whether the man groomed as its successor could bleed. For Vance, the lawsuit threatened more than his reputation. It threatened his trajectory. Every whisper about a VP nod, every headline about his rising star, every late-night phone call strategizing, his place on the ticket, all of it now carried a shadow. A single courtroom could expose him not as the heir apparent, but as a hollow pretender, and Crockett understood the gravity. She knew that stepping into that courthouse meant walking into fire. The threats, the endless distortions designed to grind her down. But she also knew something else. Movements are not made in safety. They are made in risk, in defiance, in the moment. When one person decides to stand tall and forces others to choose whether they will stand with her, the chants outside weren't just noise. They were a warning to those watching at home, those scrolling on their phones, those debating in CAFS and kitchens. History is being written here, and silence will not protect you. This wasn't just a lawsuit. It was a referendum on courage, on integrity, on whether truth could still matter in a country drowning in spectacle. And yet, as Crockett pushed deeper into this confrontation, as evidence piled against arrogance and whispers turned into roars, the danger began to shift in ways no one had predicted. Because the deeper we dig, the more dangerous this confrontation becomes. Before the cameras, before the Senate seat, before the flirtations with power at the highest levels of American politics, JD Vance was a storyteller. He crafted a memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, that struck like a cultural lightning bolt. To many in the country's elite circles, it read as a translation of an unfamiliar America, an intimate portrait of poverty, addiction, and survival in Appalachia. To them, Vance was not just an author. He was a guide into a world they had long ignored. Overnight, he became the authentic voice for the forgotten white working class. But even then, contradictions simmered beneath the surface. While the book told of food stamps, broken homes, and grandparents raising children in towns hollowed out by economic decline, the man behind it was already far removed from that struggle. Yale law had polished him, Silicon Valley had welcomed him, and billionaire networks had embraced him as one of their own. Vance became a fixture at venture capital firms, sipping wine in tech boardrooms, a long way from the trailer parks he described in prose. Still, the myth stuck. He was packaged as the boy who escaped poverty but never forgot it, the bridge between Appalachia's pain and America's prosperity. Yet as the years unfolded, another transformation began, one more jarring, more calculating, more opportunistic than the first. For a time, Vance was openly critical of Donald Trump and the movement that would later crown him. He derided Trump as a demagogue, warning that the country risked trading its dignity for cheap theatrics. He presented himself as a thinker, above the chaos, rooted in moral clarity. But as the winds of politics shifted, so too did Vance's convictions. One by one, his criticisms faded. The sharp words softened into excuses, then into endorsements, until the same man who once condemned Trump became one of his most fervent disciples. The conversion was not quiet. It was loud, theatrical, and dripping with opportunism. Vance didn't just align with MAGA. He wrapped himself in its banner, railing against immigrants, amplifying conspiracy theories, and sneering at the very elites who had paved his own ascent. His reinvention was total the outsider. Intellectual became the insider, demagogue, and in that reinvention lay the seeds of his fragility, because every strongman is weakest where he pretends to be strongest. Vance branded himself as the champion of the working class, but his lifestyle and alliances betrayed Silicon Valley wealth and venture capital privilege. He cloaked himself in populism, but his words were often tailored for television studios rather than factory floors. He boasted of loyalty, yet his own history revealed betrayal of his roots, of his earlier beliefs, of the very voters he claimed to embody. The arrogance grew with his ambition. By the time whispers of a vice presidential run reached the public, Vance carried himself with the air of inevitability, as if the crown were already resting on his brow. His speeches sharpened into sound bites. His persona hardened into a caricature of swagger. To his allies, he was the intellectual MAGA had been waiting for. To his critics, he was proof of how quickly conviction could be sold for a chance at power. And perhaps that was the deepest betrayal of all. Not of politics, not of party, but of the very people he had once written about. The families in forgotten towns, the children raised by grandparents, the mothers working double shifts. They became props in his ascent. Stories stripped of their complexity and bent into slogans that served his ambition. The boy who claimed to be their voice had used their pain as a ladder, climbing high enough to forget the faces below. It was here, in this chasm between myth and reality, that Crockett's lawsuit struck its first chord. Because if JD Vance had built his empire on the illusion of authenticity, what would happen when the curtain was pulled back? What would remain when arrogance collided with accountability? The crowd outside the courthouse wasn't just reacting to paperwork. They were reacting to years of contradiction finally being confronted. For every cheer, there was an echo of betrayal. For every chant, a memory of promises broken. And that is why this lawsuit cut so deep. It wasn't simply Crockett versus Vance. It was truth versus theater. Conviction versus opportunism. The fragile strongman, who had worn the mask of loyalty and grit, now stood on trial not just in the legal sense, but in the court of public opinion. The story of JD Vance had been rewritten many times, from struggling child to memoirist, from Silicon Valley darling to MAGA firebrand. But reinventions built on convenience eventually collapsed, and the cracks were beginning to show. But while Vance reinvented himself, Crockett's story was written in fire. Long before Jasmine Crockett's name echoed through Congress, before the cameras tracked her steps and microphones chased her words, she was a young woman staring down a world that did not expect her to succeed. She knew what it meant to live with less, to feel overlooked, to sense that the game was rigged before she had even stepped onto the field. Where JD Vance used his childhood as a springboard for personal myth-making, Crockett lived hers as a forged one that shaped steel out of struggle, resolve out of rejection. Her story didn't begin in the glassy corridors of Yale or Silicon Valley. It began in classrooms and community centers, in neighborhoods where survival often depended on knowing how to fight back, how to speak up, how to demand respect when none was freely given. From the beginning, she was that voice, sharp, unafraid, unwilling to let silence become complicity. Law was not just a profession she chose, it was a weapon she picked up, while others pursued it for prestige. Crockett saw it as a shield for those who had none. She fought for clients no one else would touch, standing beside the poor, the marginalized, the forgotten. Her courtroom was not adorned with power and wealth. It was filled with the ordinary people America often discarded. And each time she stood to speak, each time she challenged the system, she carved a space not only for her clients but for herself. It was in those courtrooms that her resilience became legend. Judges tried to rattle her, opposing counsel dismissed her. And yet she never wavered. She walked in with her head held high, her voice steady, her fire unmistakable. For every woman told she was too loud, too bold, too unfit to let Crockett was proof that volume could be power, boldness could be strategy. And fitness for leadership came not from privilege but from persistence. Her leap into politics wasn't born of ambition. It was born of necessity. Communities needed a fighter who wouldn't trade principle for comfort, who wouldn't sell authenticity for a seat at the table. And so she ran and won. Congress became the next stage in her journey. But the battles were familiar. Rooms full of arrogance, voices dripping with condescension, colleagues who underestimated her before she even opened her mouth. She responded the way she always had, with grit sharpened into eloquence, with truth delivered in the cadence of a cross-examination. Her rise was not built on reinvention, but on consistency. She did not shed her past to fit into politics. She carried it with her, holding it up as a banner. Every speech, every debate, every fiery exchange on the House floor reminded people watching at home of something they had nearly forgotten, that politics could still sound like real life, like someone speaking for you rather than at you.